They came at dawn, not with weapons, not with warnings. They came with paperwork. A single document, signed by men in distant rooms who would never face what they had done. And in one silent morning, entire lives were erased, legally. Imagine waking up and discovering that the law, the very system designed to protect you, has become the weapon aimed at your family, your home, your name, your history, gone, not because of a crime, not because of violence, but because someone in power decided it was convenient. This is not fiction. This is not a warning from a dystopian novel. This happened. It was buried, deliberately, and the families it shattered never fully recovered. Governments throughout history have passed laws they called progress. They dressed tyranny in legal language, stamped it with official seals, and called it order. But beneath the surface of these laws lived something terrifying, a mechanism to control, to silence, and to destroy. The darkest tools of oppression were never swords or fire. They were laws. And the question we must ask ourselves, the question history forces us to answer, is this: how do you fight back when the weapon destroying you is the law itself? To understand how a law becomes a weapon, you must first understand the world in which it was forged. Picture it, a society under pressure, a government under threat, or at least telling its citizens it was. The air was thick with fear, with unspoken rules, with the understanding that certain questions were forbidden. Communities thrived, diverse, resilient, full of people who had built their lives from nothing. Families with deep roots, workers, farmers, merchants, people who trusted the system because the system had never turned on them yet. But behind the walls of government, decisions were being made, quietly, deliberately. A law was being written, not to protect the people, but to control them, to classify them, to brand entire groups as problems to be managed. The architects of this law were not monsters in the storybook sense. They were bureaucrats, officials, men in suits who used language like national interest and social stability as shields against moral accountability. They were terrifyingly ordinary. When the law passed, most citizens barely noticed. It was buried in dense legal text. It made headlines for one day, then vanished. But the communities targeted by it, they felt it immediately. Stripped of rights they thought were permanent, cut off from land they had owned for generations, forced into systems of compliance that degraded and dehumanized. And then came the detail that changes everything. The very judges sworn to uphold justice were legally forbidden from ruling against it. Here is what was buried. The law did not simply restrict, it redesigned reality. It created categories of citizens, and then decided that some categories did not deserve the same protections as others. Rights became privileges. Privileges became conditional, and conditions were impossible to meet. Children were registered, families were catalogued, property was seized under legal terms that sounded neutral. Words like redistribution, reallocation, reorganization. But we know what those words meant in practice. They meant, we are taking what is yours, and we have written a law to make it legal. Parents watched the futures they had built for their children dissolve. Schools became instruments of conformity. Entire cultural histories were reclassified as threats. Languages were banned. Traditions were criminalized. And those who resisted, they vanished. Not metaphorically. People were taken from their homes in the middle of the night, transported to facilities that did not officially exist, held without trial, under provisions, buried so deep in the law that their families could not even challenge their detention, because the law said there was nothing to challenge. And then, the moment that should have changed everything, a whistleblower, an insider, someone who had worked within the system and could no longer bear the weight of what they knew. They produced records, internal documents, memos signed by the very officials who publicly denied the law's true purpose. The documents revealed something unimaginable. The destruction was not a side effect. It was the plan. The suffering of these communities had been calculated, projected, written into projections by people who measured human lives in columns and rows, and the officials above them had approved it, and then buried the evidence so deeply that decades would pass before the world saw even a fragment of the truth. This was not accidental cruelty. This was engineered destruction, dressed in the language of law. When the truth finally surfaced, the world reacted, slowly, because power rarely collapses quickly. It negotiates, it delays, it releases statements of deep regret, while protecting the architects of the damage from any real consequence. The officials responsible largely died in comfort. The families they destroyed did not recover so easily. Generations had been fractured. Children grew up without cultural identity. Adults carried psychological wounds that medical systems were not equipped to treat. Communities that had once been vibrant were now hollow. The people still present, but the spirit of what they had been, gone. Some governments eventually issued formal apologies. Some paid reparations, amounts so small compared to the scale of the harm that survivors called them insulting. Legal reviews acknowledged that the law had been unjust. Courts, decades later, ruled that the rights of those communities had been violated. But here is the terrifying part of the consequence. Laws like this still exist. Not always in the same form, not always with the same language, but the architecture, the idea that governments can classify groups, restrict rights legally, and bury the evidence, that architecture is never truly dismantled. We see it today in surveillance legislation, in emergency powers extended far beyond their original scope, in laws passed in crisis that quietly remain after the crisis ends. The families of those who suffered were told to move on, to accept what could not be undone. But you cannot build a just future on a buried past. History does not disappear because we stop looking at it. History has never been kind to silence. Every generation that looked away, while power weaponized the law, left the next generation to pay the debt. And the currency of that debt is always the same: human dignity, human freedom, human futures. What this dark history teaches us is not complicated. It is, in fact, terrifyingly simple. Laws are written by people. People are capable of extraordinary cruelty when shielded by institutional power. And the only force that has ever stopped that cruelty is awareness, scrutiny, the refusal to accept that something is right simply because it is legal. The families destroyed by this law deserved better. They deserved us. People willing to look at the darkness without flinching, to say, this happened, it was wrong, and we will not let it be forgotten. The question we leave you with is one that has no comfortable answer. If this law had been passed in your lifetime, would you have noticed? Would you have spoken? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And if this history shook you the way it shook us, make sure you're subscribed, because there are stories like this one that the world is still not ready to face. We're going to face them anyway.